Here in the centre of Newent, the old market town. Stood in the marketplace near the market house, and I've lived here all my life. And I want to take you round the town and share some memories with you. We're just coming into Newent now on the Gloucester Street end, walking down the high pavement as we call it. When I was a boy, it always seemed to be part of a community up here. People were related and working together. The doors were open when the weather was nice. They would come out bringing their chairs out. Some of the old men and women, mostly old men, would be sitting because they were crippled with arthritis. We could exchange greetings in those days, you see, because it was so quiet, and we did, and it was lovely. And of course, when you were driving the cart, you were very often stood in the back driving, so you were almost up at their level. We used to refer to this Gloucester Street. It was Gloucester Street, up the street. That was the local way of saying street. And up here lived families that were connected with Lancaster's sawmills, the English sawmills. They took in oaks and elms and all that sort of thing. A really vivid recollection is of the men. In the morning they would have got their bicycles out from underneath the pavement. There were little doors all the way up which led into the cellars under the houses. Also their empty truck, perhaps, if it was the day to fetch the wood from the sawmills for their houses, because most of these open fires were done with the natural wood, you know, kept hot with the natural wood, and so that was the scene in the morning, and off they go. When they came back home at night, there was this sound of all these trucks coming down loaded, one behind the other, all the way down through Newent, because it was a high point in Newent, the sawmills was. You used to sort of greet them with a cheer as normal, you know. How we are? Oh, how are you going on? Or something like that. Keep going. You'll get there if you keep going. And the sound of the truck was rattling on the road, you know. And of course up through here, because it's a cut-in down, it's a sort of sunken street, the sound was quite loud and magnified. There was an entry here, very narrow, and steps all the way up to the top of the bank. And that was the way up to the thatched cottage called Berryfields. They lived on well water up there. There was no mains. And I always remember Father having a letter, and they condemned the water in the well because they used to test it. And the tenant, Cecil Phillips, complained that he didn't want new water, he just wanted water out of the well because he'd lived on it for years and there was nothing wrong with him. And then so the council gave way and said, well, so long as he was still there, he could drink the water, but once he moved from there, it had to be condemned. There was a real sort of community here, which partly joined up with Upper Church Street, just round the corner below. So there was big families in fairly small houses too. There were the Jameses. They must have been 8 children. I've heard tales from some of the children there, saying how he kept a stick on the table or next to the table at meal times always, just to show them what happened if they didn't behave themselves. And everything, obviously, because it was a big family, it had to be done orderly fashion, otherwise it would become chaos. And of course they went to bed, and I expect the younger ones went to bed first, and the younger ones would have slept more than one in a bed. And I think probably there may have been 1 or 2 sleeping in the other end of the bed too, so they'd all have warm toes. The street today, Upper Church Street, follows the same track as it used to. There was a lane which went round to the back of these houses, and they had gardens and places to put bicycles and that sort of thing. Halfway down there was Rhoda Royals and Buzzy Lock. They'd be from gypsy families originally. Buzzy Lock, who walked along the street with a little fox terrier dog lying on his shoulders. When the houses went, also what went with it was the people. It was the community spirit of people who lived together for a long time, and they moved into other parts of Newent. Where the corner is, it turns into Church Street, and there was a wall all around this corner, which was a boundary of a bigger house next to the Black Dog. The bills all used to be stuck there, because years ago that was how they advertised things, and Miss Cook was the bill sticker that I can remember. She would have been the last one, and she used to come with her paste pot on her bicycle and take her life in her hands on that corner. They were notices for sales, farm sales, house sales, important meetings perhaps. This house here, Oakwood, was where the policeman lived when my father was a boy, which would have been over 100 years ago, of course. And the children used to hide in the churchyard behind the gravestones, having slipped across the road and tied some cotton on his door knocker. And then they'd pull the door knocker, and he'd come to the door, nobody there. How many times they got away with it, I don't know. We're now in a little development called the Butts bungalows. This was a field in the grounds of Newent Court, and in 1945, at the end of the war, this was where we had our celebration bonfire to burn the effigy of Hitler and Mussolini, and I was about 13 then. I can remember all the town came down here, and there was two big pine trees just a way off there, just up there. They were climbable part of the way up, and I can remember seeing all these boys up in the trees there. They were huge. One was called the King and the other was called the Queen Pine. We had this huge great bonfire, and it's such a celebration with all the fire, you know, and when a small boy, you know, it was very exciting because it was a very happy, very, very happy occasion. We've come to some what look like brick-built houses on the street here, but aren't, like many of the houses in Newent. If you go inside, you find they got beams, and they were obviously half-timbered houses, and the bricks were put on the front, I imagine really to make them warmer perhaps, and tidy them up as well. The George is a special place for me because there's a lot of family history here. My mother's side of the family were landlords of hotels. They moved to the George, which was the main hostelry in the town. They had horses because it was a post house, and when they came there, of course, there was a stagecoach running, and there was an ostler there to look after the horses. When he was old, he was still working there, or pretending to work, when he couldn't do anything else, but he was with the family all the time. Just over the road from the George, back in the 30s, there used to be a garage. Bob Beechus was well known as a very original, pioneering car mechanic. This was Beechus's garage here, where the shambles is now, and they had a petrol pump on the side of the road just here. And cars used to pull up alongside here to fill up. There was just one single petrol pump which used to fill the cars up across the pavement. Of course, they were banned in later years, but that was the only way that he could service them anyway was doing it by there. And people used to say, if you can't get your car to go down to Bob Beach's and he'll mend it with his hammer. And he was a real character, he was, and I loved him very much. Well, of course, the Beaches, as a lot of people did in those days, lived above the business, and in a top window where the garage was, in that bedroom, I used to go up there when I was young. And Joe Meek, he became quite famous in later years. He had lantern shows up there. We all gathered in, and I mean, when you think we were only probably 10, 12, something like that, and we went in and we sat down, maybe on the floor or on a box or something like that. And then he showed the lanterns. They were stills. You could speed up the shutters, I suppose, and they would come through. You see, when they were moving, that was quite fascinating to us, and we were that age, because there was no television. Just over the road, nearby, there's a clock shop. And a little door used to be the entrance of the old veterinary surgery. Dr. West was what they called the vet. The family were also farriers in the town. And very often farrier was joined to veteran in those days. Because of course there wasn't all these colleges and that then to learn. And there was a lot of old remedies and no modern ones, of course. And when I was a kid, I used to be sent down to Mr. Boyd, to go and get a pot of this or a pot of that, something or other, to jollop, to cure something, Further along Church Street, there used to be one big grocery business. C&F Thurston's Country Grocers, who delivered to all parts. To go into that shop was an absolute eye-opener. The smells of cheese and ham and bacon, they take me back to my childhood. There was a row of biscuit tins with glass tops, so that you could look down into those and see what lovely biscuits you'd like your mother to buy. They were mostly men in there, but they were so polite and dressed wearing grocers' clothes down nearly to their ankles. There were sort of tassels on the bottom, probably to stop the flies. This shop was Bidmead's, the builders, which then became Bidmead and Watson, and then Watson. One of Watson's men was Maurice Brooks, and he'd have a grey smock on, and he'd say, "Well, what do you want, Eric?" "Well, so I'm looking for something that you don't find very easily." And he'd say, "Oh, I'll go out the back and have a look." Then he'd disappear, and you'd hang about for about 20 minutes for whatever he wanted. And then he'd come wandering back in. "This is what you want, is it, Eric?" "Oh yes, Maurice, that's just what I want." He used to have two men working in there, and it was rather funny. They used to take it in turns to go to the George to have a drink during hours. They weren't fussy when they had a drink years ago. It helped the day along. Coming up to the market house here, there are always a few old men chewing tobacco and this sort of thing. and whiling away their time. They'd sit over there on the pavement by the market house. There was another old boy that used to live in the market square here, in the corner, which is no longer inhabited now. But and he, Dawdy Davis, that was. And when we were kids, I mean, he used to go for a little walk up the Berry Bar Lane, which is round the back of here, and say to each other, "Watch out, yours old Dawdy, watch you don't get spit on." He used to chew. A lot of people used to chew tobacco in those days. And it was some pretty rough old stuff, you know. What was they call it? Twist, wasn't it? I think. During the war, the Home Guard had their headquarters here, the Newent section over there. That building on the corner where the Rogan Joss is now. That was downstairs. And upstairs, there was a lady called Miss Clark who used to live there. She was fairly elderly. They were cleaning their guns and a gun went off and a bullet went up through the ceiling, up into poor Miss Clark's room. Luckily, she was missed and she survived. This is the house here, Albion House in the Market Square, where I was living from the age of 4. And I could see, as I was growing up, I could see Newent being very busy all the time. And in 1939, the Chipperfields circus came to Newent. Just my father and me, we'd go up the lane into the field at the top of Berry Bar, and then the big top would come into view. I can remember the horses pulling the living vans. I don't expect there's very many people can remember that happening, because of course they had horses in the circus and performing. This was when they were working horses as well. Over 80 horses were grazing in our fields while the circus was here. When you think, it's like almost like moving a village from town to town, you know, when they went. And of course all the animals they used to use. Elephants then usually came by rail and walked from the station. Of course, that was an advert for them, for setting up the circus for people to come and see. Down here where I'm stood, this was the site of the fairs before they moved out into the fields. Up there was old Mr. Brewer, who I think probably lost his arm in the First World War. He used to have a smock on and a hook on his arm. He had the children's roundabout. He used to wind it by hand and it used to go round. And it was all brass, you know, those barley sugar bars that held the seats in. It was a lovely thing. The surface of the market square here was just a sort of mixture of stone and dirt and everything. And I suppose it used to be cleaned up with a man with a wheelbarrow and a brush. It was very handy, this dirt, for us when we were kids, because we could scratch holes in it and make marks in it. It's a little bit softer down by the market house, and we used to dig a hole out and play marbles in the holes. And you can imagine the animals being brought through here, walked to the cattle market up at the top of the market square there. There would have been a bit of debris. We're stood up outside the entrance to the Memorial Hall now, which is sited on the site that was previously used as a cattle market in Newent. All left idle after the market stopped for some long time, because that was in the 30s. Money was very short. A great place for us children, especially the Market Street gang, to play our games and do cops and robbers and all the rest of it up there. George Meek used to make cider up here, and there was a cider press going and all sorts, and casks up the alleyways between the pens, fermenting. We used to just run this place wild though around here. This is also where Joe Meek, who was George Meek's son, playing with us all up here, the little Market Square gang, and the Home Guard had been doing exercises up here, and there was a phosphorus bomb carelessly left in one of the cattle pens, and of course it got picked up and got smashed against the iron, like we were never doing anything wrong, but we did that day. And of course he got the phosphorus, it was a phosphorus bomb, and he got that on his hands, and of course he was very ill, and I can remember him sitting in his front room with a little bowl full of milk, and he had to keep his hands in this milk. Every time if he picked his hands out of the milk, it used to start on fire again. The cattle market was intact until the war years. Pens and all were taken away and used for the war effort. You can still travel round and see places where iron fences were cut off and taken away for munitions. Some of the boundary fence is still there now, but it just about all went, and all of a sudden the old market was clear and the place was empty. Then in the 50s, money had been collected to build a memorial hall to all the men who had died in the war. I just want to tell you a little story about when I was a child. I lived in Albion House, and there's a window up there very close to the floor, and that window is on the cellar steps. And Father used to get us down there during the war when we could hear the planes going over. We always could recognise the one type of German bomber, and we had to go down there when we were kids and all sit along the passage down there, which seemed to be the most protected place in the house. Dressed in our dressing gowns, keep us warm. We are right in the market square here, and the cows used to come down the lane, down this way, and up through here every day to be milked in the cow shed up there, obviously by hand. And there was a cider house right nearby where the men couldn't resist leaving the cows and going in and having a drop of cider in amongst the milking. This was Joe Meek's house, right near us in the market square. He later became recognised for his music making talent. I can remember going down into the cellars here with my father to see how many rats we'd caught in the live traps for the licensee, Mr. Newent. After he left, Tom Collett came as the licensee, who was a retired jockey stable lad. He was a very nimble man, very quick and very even quick to jump over the counter if there was trouble in the bar. And he could serve 2 or 3 people at once with pints in each hand and the money change in his teeth. He was a great character. I could see Tom Collett now kneeling on this step here, scrubbing it, just like he used to scrub the horses when he was in stables. When I was a teenager, the first 2 cattle that I owned, I used to bring them across from the farmyard and down through here and into the little field next to the Victorian police station. It was so easy for me to come across to them from the house to look after them. Inside this building is one of Newent's best kept secrets. Now a stockroom for the shop, there is a most beautiful oak ceiling, and it's probably one of the oldest parts of the town. It was known as the Booth Hall and was a sort of public meeting place which they had in market towns. I remember the nicer shop in my early days as the old International Stores, a branch of a London company. We weren't big customers of theirs. Us local people were very keen to stay with the local families and local family shops rather than the big store shops. There was also this shop on the end of Court Lane that used to stock feed. It was a job to get feed because there was coupons. This was wartime and just after the war. You had to go with your coupons to claim your bags of feed that you were allowed to feed your animals. And poor Mr. Gore, he was so good-hearted and used to help you out as much as he could. And then he used to get a backlog of the orders, really, and not enough coupons to cover them to send back to the ministry. And I used to feel really sorry for him because we all tried to get more than we should have. This was the tobacconist that I can remember here, Oliver Lewis. He was here for many years with all selections of tobacco pipes and things like that. The next shop was an electrical shop. I suppose that would have been the first one there had ever been in Newent. His name was Lester Nichols. And of course it was a step from the past into the future, really, because he was doing the old radios, wireless as we called them then, and he was also still looking after the people who hadn't got electricity in the town, and from the countryside, who'd got accumulators and batteries to run theirs on. And just round the corner in the market square, some of that property hadn't got electricity. When I was a child, I used to bring the little accumulators down to get them charged up in the electricians. It used to cost 6p. Country Corner at one time was a butcher shop. Also became, during the war, the official sort of place where you collected your coupons so that you could get food and fuel. So the one half was the fuel office then, and the other part was the food office. And they used to call Frank Chidley, who was in charge of it, they used to call him Lord Woolton, because Lord Woolton was the Minister of Food in London during that time. And of course people always made fun of people who had official jobs. When I was a child, this was a shoe repairer's, or another shoe repairer's, Mr. Jones. He used to stand in this window with his last. The light must have helped his work, and he'd be tapping away all the time when we used to come by. This building was a long-time butcher's shop with a slaughterhouse at the back. There's a doorway and an alleyway through, a wide one, so they obviously used to bring animals or carcasses through there. They couldn't keep them very long because they hadn't got the cold storage, and there was always a late night opening on Saturday night so they could sell the meat off. And no shops were open on Sunday anyway. So some people waited until Saturday night to fetch their meat, and then of course they tried to get a bargain. Since I can remember, back in the 30s, there's been a bakery here. This was Alfred West's. In the 30s, 40s and into the 50s, he made good bread here. Mark Lake followed Mr. West into the business. He had some pigs in Culver Street, down the lane, Puff's Alley. There was a piece of land down there where he used to keep pigs, and I can remember going with Joe Phillips with a horse and cart, taking the straw. This was before bales. They take the load of straw up there for the pigs to bed on. All these little fields and holdings were tight into the town then, of course. We were coming to the end of an era when people were keeping pigs to help with the food in the winter. Families who were quite large in some of the cottages, most of them killed a pig and they kept it in the pig cot at the end of the garden. They fed it on scraps and anything they could get, and then it was salted into bacon, which was usually hung on the wall in the house to dry. Stop them being up there, and he's managing to walk between the spikes, and just shows you how clever they are. The end of an era now with Lloyd's Bank closing. My family were customers there for so many years. Behind me is Barclays Bank, originally the Nag's Head pub, where hijinks were performed on market days, and people were known to stay overnight after market, having been rather too drunk to get home. And to the side is a white door, and that was the entrance to the once a week egg packing station, which sounds rather ridiculous these days, as run for the Cheltenham Egg Cooperative, and Miss Cook, which was a good name in the town, used to run that, and it's a great name for small farmers around Newent to come in with their produce and have a conversation. Upstairs was a room, quite a large ballroom there, which was used with the pub, and then became a meeting room for the WI and the young farmers. Before the Memorial Hall was built, it was probably the leading place to meet. They didn't used to have any posh dances in here. It was usually the sort of socials and smaller dances. Weekend dances in here would have been, and it wasn't in very good condition then, the decoration, and it hasn't changed one bit. At the end of the building there was obviously a place where they kept a horse for the pub, because there's a tallet door at the top where they would have pushed the hay through and the food, and then they fed it down through a rack, I expect. Squeezed between the higher buildings, it was obviously an older bit. It just is so interesting to look at these buildings a little bit closer than just glancing as you drive through or walk through. This brings back lots of memories with friends, gangs out of the town. We used to come to the picture house, as we called it, waiting outside to come in, you see, and then they opened the door and we all poured in then to get our tickets, go and run down, find a seat, used to come and watch the westerns and see the cowboys like Roy Rogers. Upstairs, up there, up the gallery there was the projection room, and Don Boughton was the one I can remember up there being the projectionist, and he had to struggle with the little things that went wrong. Just no picture or something sometimes, or the sound went, and then after a minute or two there was a little bit of frustration in the audience, and then the boys in the front started banging their feet up and down on the ground, and the projectionist was called to come down, because he was a big strong fella, to come down and try and help to restore order. Poor Miss Cook, she had to put up with so much. I used to afford 10p to go upstairs on a Saturday night, you know. It was very quiet up there compared with down in the stalls. Slightly more expensive seats, about a penny or two in old money, and that was where the courting couples used to get to. Miss Cook used to have to go around sometimes with her torch to shine along, and just to keep people in order. The smoking was another thing too, because of course smoking, you smoked anywhere then. Built-in ashtrays. When you'd been in there some time and there was these people had all been smoking, You could see all the smoke drifting up through the projection beams, and it was all hanging over the top, all this smoke. And of course we thought nothing of it, because it was part of how we lived then. This is the actual sign that in the height of film days was on the outside of this building. So there it was in all its glory. It's the actual thing that I came up and walked under into the building when I was about 8, 10, something like that. The old picture house closed in 1971. Right, the building behind me was the original post office in Newent after the postal service started, and was run for many, many years by the Biscoe family, one of whom, Bob Biscoe Sr., is responsible for us having such a wonderful collection of photographs from the 1912 era, I suppose. This was George Nunn's, the baker's shop here. Cooked his own bread, and they had a sweet shop as well. And I used to come down here probably for sweets, I think. He used to deliver the bread normally on his bicycle. And there was a photograph in the window here of Biscoe's collection with a bicycle parked outside in long earlier years than when I left mine there. But I left mine outside this shop, and it was parked there. And I don't know why, I forgot all about it. And the policeman came to see me, and he said, "Eric, is that your bicycle outside Nunn's shop?" "Yes." He said, "Well, you better get and collect it." He said, "And don't you do it again." Yes, Sergeant. We had a sergeant and 2 constables, I think, in Newent. Sergeant lived at the police station, and there were cells there to lock up miscreants, for the night and all, and let them sober up. I can remember this as a child, being the last saddler and harness maker from the old working horse days, and Mr. Ayres was the last saddler here. Of course, very, very important person in a small town was the man who did the saddlery and the harness work, because of course all the transport was by horses. Then of course when things changed to internal combustion engine, gradually their need went. This shop, now the Co-op, was where my grandfather started his drapery business in the 1890s. The name was emblazoned right across the top, Manchester House, and my father and his sister were both born there. And next to Steve Gucci's, you've got the entrance to the car park. Well, there was a butcher shop there and a slaughterhouse behind, and there was even a ring in the floor where I think they used to tie the animals down by their head. So they probably in the days when they used a poleaxe rather than a gun. And double doors here at the entrance led to the slaughterhouse at the back. And they would have taken the animals this way, and there was a horse there, I know, and a stable. And there were private grounds down there, big vegetable gardens and things. Next door to the Golden Cone is a house called Chidley House. That is part of the same premises, really, where the family used to live that had the butcher's shop. This was Leewall Street, now part of High Street. It used to be dominated by a very tall wall, a brick wall which was the perimeter of the Holt estate. And the wall continued here round into Watery Lane, roughly where the entrance to the health centre is now, and that was a doorway in the wall there. And there was a mansion inside there. I can remember when I was a little kid lifting the latch to go through and across the gravel area and then into the house to the waiting room. And then the doctor was across a little hall. And in his huge great lounge in the corner he used to see the patients lying on a couch. It's to come along under that wall over there and round the corner into Watery Lane with a bunch of sheep and the dog and the bike, take them up as far as the gasworks. Opposite the gasworks was the recreational ground, and Father used to graze that in the summer. Over the years there had always been animals on the road driving. That was the way of moving them, so people were used to it and would keep their gates shut, and gates were there to be opened and then shut, as Father said. This row of houses is built now. There was a row of almshouses all down here, built back in end of the 16th century or something like that. Nan, Fan and Dobin, two families that had a charity, and they built these almshouses for people who were in need. There was only one entrance, and that was under an arch with a big door in it, which they shut every night. Then there was a brick pathway from there you went through. And then all the little doors of the little houses were from the back. I remember visiting a great aunt here. They were very small and poky, one bedroom and one room downstairs. And there was a big garden out there, which a chap called Peddler Palmer, that I used to remember, used to help do, and lived here, I think, as well. The old houses were emptied and then they were knocked down in the 60s. Part of the top end of these houses was Cook's the baker's, a very old house that was as well. I've got good memories of the bakery shop and the family and their horse-drawn bread cart that went round the town. Jimmy Cook would stop a long time talking while the horse went on to the next customer. That takes us nearly to the top of Crown Hill. This used to be the site of the old workhouse. The workhouse closed in 1925 and the grammar school replaced it, with just a single story then. And on that fateful day in 1943, when I started school there as a child and heard all these stories about what they did to the new pupils, I stood on top of the hill up there, Crown Hill, and looked across with some of my friends that were going to start as well. Anyway, we took courage in our hands and went down, and these boys were waiting for us at the railing. They grabbed us and took us down for the initiation ceremony, filling the wash basins and pushing our heads underwater. After we were nearly drowned, we were brought round and pushed into these tunnels where the workhouse inmates used to crack stones for the roads, and squashulated, as we called it. All the boys get behind us and they'd just push us into the corner and we'd be squashed there, and the ones on the very inside were probably panicking a lot and wondering how they were going to get any breath before they got out. But we all lived through it. And then we took our part when we got older as well. And there was sticky paper all over the windows in crosses and things, which was done to prevent blast, from a bomb or anything like that, to stop splintering and the glass flying around inside. And that was on there all the time till after the war. Before I came down to this school, and I was at Piconash, from the time I was about 4, I suppose, Evacuees arrived from Birmingham, most of them, by train to Newent station. We went home a night, and when we came back to school next day, it was taken over by these evacuees, and we were quite offended, really, because we were local. I can remember the pots, the little china pots that they'd used in there for their toilets, and there were some put out on the steps outside the door. And so we weren't very kind to them. Looking back on it, I thought we weren't very welcoming, really. And I mean, the poor kids had had a really rough time and probably been bombed out and all sorts in Birmingham. But we didn't know anything about that, you see. All we were interested in was really the farms and getting crops in, which we used to have to help with sometimes, and all those sort of things, local things, our own school life, you know. When I was at Pickle-Nash, after school we'd walk down through here, through the old English timber sawmills, which today would be, well, it'd make people gasp, I should think, with those great big trees all stacked there, and machines. Used to come down by the corner where they kept all the saws, and you could see the men cutting the wood up, the coffin boards and all that sort of thing. We came down to the road by the railway bridge, turned right. Just the other side by the fire, where the fire station is now, there was a row of cottages end on, another row of very low cottages against the road, and that was what was the old canal basin, I think. And then there was Jenkins's, the farriers and blacksmiths, and Miss Jenkins had a sweet shop, and that was where we were heading from school after we used to come down here. I mean, there was other ones in the town, but why did we come down here? Because with our mates, you know, it was adventure. Here we are, Newent Station. It was a lovely little old quiet town station. Opposite the station stood the signal box there, and the signalman was Percy Dallow. In my young days I used to be friendly with his son, and we used to come and visit him in his signal box. And I can remember the big levers, you know, that they changed the signals with, and they always had a cloth in their hand, and they were brass, the handles, where they were all shone in there. And we'd stand in there and look out at the train or whatever. And we have also gone up the line when they were shunting, perhaps, and have a ride by the oven, you know, the fire on the steam railway, down as far as the bridge which goes over the Newent Road and back again, which was a thrill for us when we were children. At least once a year, my relatives used to come down on holiday from Birmingham. And when they went back, we would always load them with things to take on the train with them. The old-fashioned plywood tea chests, you know, we used to use those for, and put all these apples and pears in there, and a couple of chickens and all sorts for them to take back, you know. It was a big occasion when somebody came down to Newent from outside. It was an entirely different life, really, and I just love looking back on it, you know, and feel so glad to be alive before it had all gone. That little door down there that says clock shop over it. the little door where it says. All of a sudden the gun went off and.
Rick, you're up early again this morning.
Oh, yes, John. That's Kim, that is, off ploughing. Ledbury ploughing match today. And a doorway in the wall there. Somebody come in there.
That was a doorway in the wall.
Yeah, that was a doorway in the wall there, a small pedestrian door with brass. I'm pretty sure there was brass. They were built from two families called.
I'll just leave you to do it in your own time.
Yeah.